There's another saying that fit my friend the Bruiser. And it's that old saying, live by the sword and die by the sword. Really, he lived by the sword.
Frank did not lack any ingredient to being a star, and that's the reason he was a mega star and a legendary star.
Bruiser Brody was one of the most vicious men I've ever seen in a wrestling ring.
Tough as nails, wild as a buck. You wrestle him, you never knew what to expect.
Bruiser Brody was the wave of a new era. One of those great, memorable characters that no creative team, no booking committee, no brain trust of creative guys could ever manufacture. He was an original.
He was a real big name that, you know, like in every place that he went, you know, he was a main eventer instantly.
In the ring, he was a violent man.
If he didn't like you, he'd beat you to death. And he had a reputation for being really rough.
He really intimidated not only the audience, but it looked like the people he was wrestling too, whoever was with him, you know.
Brody didn't care. He did what he wanted, held them up, and they hated him. But he drew money.
So he was a rebel. Not many guys would do that. There's a few guys who would argue, but they wouldn't go quite as far as Frank would.
That was his problem. He was not afraid to speak up. And that's why he was known as the rebel and difficult to do business with.
He embodied not only in the ring, but out of the ring, that outlaw spirit that professional wrestling, to me, is really about. And in good and bad ways, but he was like, you did not mess with him.
For a big man who could do what he was doing and move and had that it factor, and he commanded your attention, and he was good.
The greatest independent guy, for sure. You know, I mean, he made a really good living out of being an independent and catering to nobody.
He was a legend.
Sooner or later, something's gonna happen that you ain't gonna have no control over.
When we are on our life's journey, we share moments and memories with many different people. We leave a lasting impression on those around us whom we know intimately and ones that we hardly know. We fall in love with our soulmate and start a new journey with that person and create new moments and memories. Not all of them are great, some are painful, but the good ones always outweigh the bad. Frank Goodish, my husband, was known to wrestling fans as Bruiser Brody, but to me he was simply Frank, my husband, my best friend, the father of our son, a man like no other. It is time for the story of Bruiser Brody to be told, not just the wrestler, but also the person. Frank was so different from the image he portrayed in wrestling. Frank was meant to do amazing things beyond professional wrestling, but in life, some things are unexpected and they shatter your world. Bad things happen to good people. One phone call can change everything.
Terry Gordy called me up on the phone and he says, man, I just got a phone call, and he says, Frank's dead. And I said, what?
Dory Funk Jr., I don't know if I called him or he called me, but I think I called him. And he pretty much told me it's true. And so that's how I remember it. But it was like I went into a funk, like something fierce. Like for 2 weeks, it was just like complete funk. It was terrible.
I was at home, I was working, I was on a riding bike. Meltzer called me. He says, something's wrong. He says, something happened to Brody last night in Puerto Rico. He says, I don't know if he got hurt in a match or what, but I heard there's a lot of blood, and I don't know if he said, I'm afraid he might be dead.
And I can close my eyes. It was when I came out of the hotel,
The road warriors were standing by the pool, distressed, and Paul Ellering walked up to me and said, "Frank's dead."
I called his hotel room and Dutch Mantell answered the phone. And I asked him and he said, yes, there had been an accident.
Victor Quinones, and he was in the office. He was a young kid. He used to be a referee. He was a referee later in the WWF. He called me and told me that there was something happened. And I said, what? He says, yeah. He says, but I don't know the whole story, but I'm sure he did.
The Brody that I know on any given day in a fair fight would still be here today.
Frank Donald Goodish was born in 1946 on the 18th of June in Uniontown, Pennsylvania. Frank's parents, Mildred and Big Frank, were wonderful people, and he had one older sister, Gail, at the time, and two younger sisters, Gloria and Kathy. His father was a coal miner, and not wanting to raise his family in a coal mining town, the Goodish family moved to Warren, Michigan, a growing suburb of Detroit. Growing up in the suburbs of Detroit, Frank stood tall amongst the other kids from day one with his height and size. He was an All-American high school football and basketball player.
Told me he wasn't that good of a basketball player, but he played with a guard. He was a frontline player with either a center or far power forward, and he had a guard who could really handle the ball. He says, so we worked really good together. That's why, he says, if somebody tried to go underneath the basket, I was taking care of that part. I was going to bump them, and I had kind of a reputation. Nobody wanted to mess with me. So they'd stay away, and my guard could really handle the ball and really make shots. He says, and if he gave me that ball in the right spot underneath, I could lay it up. I could do that part of it.
As a senior at Warren High School, Frank received several scholarship offers to play football, and he chose Iowa State University. Things just didn't work out for him at Iowa State, and he was kicked out of school. So he ended up playing at West Texas State, a football program that was known for turning out professional wrestlers.
I don't know what the reason was, in the water or the training hall or what. I know that the academic standards to get into school were somewhat lax, I'm told. So it allowed some guys that had some issues in other schools to migrate there. Frank Goodish, Bruiser Brody, had some issues, I think, at Iowa State. He came in there. So it was a melting pot for a lot of quote-unquote outlaw guys.
The most prolific university in the country for professional wrestlers was West Texas State University. And it just put out wrestler after wrestler after wrestler, you know. But it put out some great ones. And I think that, I think that what really brought some of these great football players was wrestling brought them to that area too, you know. It's part of the recruiting. You know, they see the other guys that are in the business and everything, young guys do, you know, and they were coming out of high school and, if they had any interest in wrestling, watching it on TV or anything, that was the place to be. They
attracted a lot of really great athletes. They might not have been Rhodes Scholars, all of them, but then the tradition started, which all the funk started, and then you had all the local wrestling that was there every week in Amarillo. These college kids were looking for some cheap entertainment, inexpensive entertainment, perhaps a better term. And so they would go to the wrestling and they caught the bug.
He went to Iowa State and something happened anyway. He lost his scholarship there and he ended up down there at West Texas, and that's where I ended up coming as a high school recruit. Brody was at West Texas at that time as a redshirt, which means that he couldn't play. He had to lay out 1 year, but he was there, and that's where I met Frank for the first time.
It just was really a happenstance that so many guys went through there, but you can trace it all back to the funk's influence.
You know, we were all wild and crazy at West Texas. That's why there were so many good wrestlers came out of there.
But again, Frank was kicked off the team and out of West Texas State.
Frank got in, I don't know, got in some trouble, did some things, and finally, it was the last straw.
Something happened at West Texas State. I think he cut down a tree or something and got kicked out of school there.
One way or another, he pulled up somebody's tree. So I've heard multiple stories. Either it was his coach, Coach Joe Kerbel, who was the football coach, pulled up a tree in his yard, or he pulled up a tree in these apartments that he lived at. He pulled up a tree in their yard. But one way or another, a tree was pulled up. Frank Goodish did it, and he was kicked out of West Texas State.
I don't remember the incident. I've heard the incident and heard from him and everything. I mean, everybody was we had a bunch of wild, crazy guys, including me.
Football was Frank's first love, and he began playing for the San Antonio Toros in the Continental Football League after spending some time working a manual labor job in the area. During this time, he also got a job as a sports writer for the San Antonio Express-News.
He always had wanted to be a sports writer. That was going to be his major in college. He got a job with the San Antonio newspaper, and I've talked to the editor there who worked with him, and they said he was a good writer.
Eventually, Frank got the break he had been waiting for. One of his coaches sent a tape to the Washington Redskins, and he was invited to their training camp.
He was on their taxi squad, didn't quite make it, and he always told me, he says it was his own fault. He says it was my fault. He says, I was hard to coach. He was honest about it. He said, I was hard to coach.
And then in the meantime, he was kind of buzzing around all these things. He met probably Ivan Putski, I know, was one at the gym. Pete and Jim, and there was a whole bunch of them. That's when he started really getting into serious weight training. And of course, what happens? Football players, weight trainers, what's the next step? They get into wrestling. Somebody will put, you should get into wrestling.
And Ivan Putski would later become very crucial because he is the one that brought Frank Goodish into professional wrestling. So Frank Goodish had watched the Funks wrestle, the Terry and Dory Funk wrestle in Texas when he went to West Texas State. He had gone to some of those wrestling shows. He and Dusty Rhodes talked about becoming wrestlers as sort of a joke. But it was really Ivan Putski at the San Antonio Health Club that would end up bringing Frank Goodish into the wrestling industry.
After falling out with wrestling promoter Joe Blanchard, Frank went elsewhere in Texas to break into wrestling.
So Frank Goodish went to another Texas promoter, and his name was Fritz von Erich. So he went to Fritz von Erich's territory, which was the Dallas territory, and that's really where he got his start.
I mean, I've told this story, so it's a good, true story. Bronco Lubitsch was the referee there for Fritz, and he'd come over. He said, you went to West Texas? I said, yeah, I went there. The Funk sent you. Well, that's good. He says, we got a guy over in the other dressing room. We're breaking in. He went to West Texas too. And I said, oh yeah, well, who's that? And he says, well, he's a really nice guy, and just low key and everything, just the nicest, most polite guy. I said, yeah, well, who is he? And he says, Frank Goodish. So I said, God, that crazy, wild, crazy guy? Because that was Frank's M.O. in college. He was pretty wild. And he says, no, not this guy. You must have thinking the wrong guy. And he says, yeah, Frank Goodish. I said, yeah. And I'm going, wow. Anyway, so I went across the dressing room, and there he was there. And I said, Guy, it is you. I can't believe it. I said, what's this? And he's going, he's kind of going, shh, I'm trying to get into the business, So anyway, so he was minding his P's and Q's and conforming and trying to, get in, and he did get in, and he did good.
And that's where Frank Goodish really became a superstar.
Frank the Hammer Goodish, and that was the name he picked up when he wrestled. Him and Stan Hansen broke in roughly the same time together for what was, I guess, known now or known popularly as the Mid-South Territory.
By the time I went back to Amarillo for a while and did, you know, some other things, and then when I came to work for, well, actually, it wasn't Bill Watts at that time. It was Grizzly Smith, Leroy McGurk. Bill came in about 6 months after that. But when I went in there, Grizz really liked Frank too, you know, Grizzly Smith, and he was the booker until Watts came in, and then Watts took over and everything. But yeah, so I met up with Frank there, and Grizz kind of put us together a little bit because we just kind of knew each other. And Frank got a big cowboy hat, and, you know, I had this big old broad brim hat, and I gave it to him. And anyway, he wasn't a cowboy at all.
Brody and Stan Hansen had just came in, and you talking about a pair. I'm telling you what, those guys, you could tell from the start that they were a little unique.
You know, we did pretty good. We were just young and dumb, you know, and man, we did crazy stuff, and that was a wild territory.
Typical Texas boys. I mean, they had, you know, they knew where they were going, knew what they wanted to do, and athletes like you wouldn't believe. I mean, them boys were in shape, they were strong, and they were fierce, and you could tell right quick those boys were going places.
Bill Watts split them up when he was the booker, and they were both really mad about it, but, you know, in hindsight, it was probably the best thing for both of them to go as singles.
As much as I didn't like what Watts did, you know, he really did. I think it was probably, it was better for us. Frank took it much harder than I did. He took it much more personal. I didn't like it at all either when he split us up. But looking back now, and I mean, Watts and I have talked to that a couple of times, we've seen each other, that, you know, that was probably the right thing.
Well, he was Frank Goodish with Stan Hansen, and then he went to Florida as Frank the Hammer Goodish, and I think he beat Billy Robinson for the Southern title. So that was like where he first got his singles name, because in those days, you know, if you beat somebody who was a big star, and Billy Robinson was a really big star, it was like, oh, this guy must be good. You know, and wins and losses meant so much more and everything, and he won the Southern title from Billy Robinson, so it was kind of like a sign that this Frank Goodish guy is going to be a real deal. You know, he's somebody to look out for. And then he went to WWF as Bruiser Frank Brody. And then, you know, he got his Madison Square Garden main events and, you know, kind of got a bigger rep from there.
He was in Florida, and I heard somebody said to me, you know, there's a guy down in Florida, and they said, I think he'd be a terrific opponent for you over here. And I inquired about him a little bit. And the more I heard about him, the more I liked it. So I sat down. Vince and I used to sit down on Thursdays, because Thursdays we used to do live TV out of Washington, D.C. And we'd meet in his office. He had 3 rooms. We'd go in the back room and talk and discuss different matters. And I said, look, I said, Vince, I had not met this guy. I never met him. I said, but people that I know and believe in, they really, really tell me that this guy might really be good for us. He's a big man. And Vince says, well, let's bring him in. And so we brought him in.
And then he came up to New York, and Vince McMahon Sr. didn't like that name, if I remember this correctly, because he said he didn't look good. Your last name has good in it. So it was McMahon who changed it into a more Irish-sounding name, like a McMahon. He made it a Brody.
He was a big guy, 300 pounds, in good shape, and they said that he was hadn't had all the experience in the world at the time, but he was a very convincing guy and all that.
They had a lot of faith in him, and within 3 years he was wrestling. 3 years into his career, he was wrestling for the World Championship. They had a champion at the time named Bruno Sammartino.
Bruno was God. Bruno was the man.
I think he would have worked with him right after Stan Hansen, so it would have been right after the Shea Stadium show. So, you know, Brody had to follow Stan, and Stan had broken Bruno's neck, so it was a real tough follow. I mean, how do you follow a feud with a guy who just broke Bruno Sammartino's neck?
We all follow somebody, you know. I think I was following superstar Billy Graham, and then Ernie Ladd was before him, and then Ivan Koloff. And so those 3 guys were still working with Bruno when I went into New York. And so, you know, They were finishing the programs in bigger cities, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and everything. But the new match in Madison Square Garden is going to be, whoever the new heel come in and work against Bruno, right? So I came in after Superstar Billy Graham, I think, and I broke his damn neck, and it was, I hurt him.
We were having a good match, and I was coming off the rope, and when he went to body slam me, he picked me up and we were sweaty, I guess, slippery, and he dropped me and I went straight down on my head, and that's how I broke my neck.
But Brody did real well. I mean, I remember I actually saw some tapes of those matches, and I mean, again, it was one of those things where you could see Brody's potential, but at that point he was nowhere near what he would be later on. But he was big and physical looking, and Bruno opponents, they liked like really big guys to be Bruno's opponents because Bruno was so strong.
He's one of the most vicious competitors I had ever seen in the New York WWF area.
We did good business, very good business. We sold out a lot of arenas. I'm not going to tell you we sold out every single arena every time we went in there, but it was always a profitable, result.
So he came in and followed me through with Bruno. After that, we kind of went our separate ways again until we kind of got together in Japan.
Frank's wrestling travels as Bruiser Brody took him all over the country, but when he got an opportunity to come to Australia for his first overseas trip, it changed not only his wrestling career, but his and mine's personal lives as well.
When I went to Australia, Brody was had a run in Australia, and he was finishing up, and I was coming to Australia for the first time managing Burt Bernard, who had been a big name years before. So our tours overlapped each other. So his last month was our first month. And what's interesting is we stayed at a place called the Texas Town and Country Tavern. And it was a hotel in the King's Cross section, which would be like Times Square of New York. And it was where, back in the day, during the Vietnam War, that's where all the soldiers went for their R&R. So it was a whole hotel with about 4 bars that stayed open until 5 in the morning, even though the soldiers weren't there anymore, but that's what the hotel was established, and that's where we stayed. Barbara worked at the hotel. That's where they met.
So when Frank came in, I just happened to be down the front when he came in, and he was kind of like, thought, oh wow, this is his first overseas trip. I'm somebody. And he said, I knew you because you just treated me like no. I said, not nobody, I was just treating you like I do all the other guests. So it kind of started off like that. And then we'd talk, and he was there for a long time. And then this one night, somebody didn't turn up for the 3 to 11 shift, so I had to go work the 3 to 11 shift. Well, they were at a wrestling matches, and they got back about 11 o'clock. And Carl came up and said, well, look, we're going up to the Bourbon and Beef. My boss had another, like a piano bar up the street, restaurant piano bar up the street. And why don't you just come up there with you? You're here now, just walk up with us and, we'll sit, have a chat. I said, oh, well, okay. There was about 12 of us, all sitting at this big table. And then all of a sudden, one by one, they started to leave. Oh, we're just going here, we'll be back. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. Then there was Carl and Frank. And then Carl gets up. Oh, I've just got to go see somebody. Nobody ever came back. And I found out later it was all a setup. He didn't know how to get me alone, didn't know how to do, so he figured out this way. So he set all the boys up. He said, look, I want to spend some time with her, just come and just leave. So that was how it really all began. Got serious, even though everybody was saying, oh, he's going to leave one day, you're never going to see him. Oh yeah, I figured out, well, that's okay, but it's interesting now. When he put this chunk of money on the table from his pay, and all he said was, I'm going home tomorrow, I'd like you to come with me. Not a word, no promises, no nothing. I would like you to come home, not saying anything to her. And so I knew I couldn't leave the same time that he did because I had, you know, so much to clear up. I was working, I had a place, and then he left the next day, had the money. I didn't say a word. He left the next day, left the money there. And so it took me, I think, about 7 days to, you know, just to clean up, clear out everything and to clean up everything. I got a ticket and got into San Antonio. Of course, you're a little nervous. What happens if nobody's there? There was no promises, there was no anything, but I just trusted him. I guess he trusted me, otherwise I could have kept the money and not even gone. So he trusted me enough to put that money. Knowing how frugal he was, I knew he trusted me. So what I did was come off that plane. It was like, is there anybody here? And sure, there he was, smiling away. And the rest is history. I'm still here. I guess most people already thought we were married, you know. And it was, hey, my parents are in California, my sister's in California. Why don't we stop off in Vegas on my way to Japan, get married? That was it. And it worked out. Like I said, I didn't even really have a dress. We used somebody else's ring. I didn't even have a ring at that stage. It was just one of those spur of the moment, I've got a couple of days before I go to Japan. Let's just go to Vegas. And then, like I said, he went to Japan and I went to California and stayed with his parents and sister. And we got married, never had a honeymoon. Didn't see each other for, I think it was like a 4-week, 5-week trip.
Fritz gave him his big break there. And he lived in Texas, and you know, he loved the Von Erich kids and everything like that. So it was, yeah, it just worked out. I mean, in that glory day of world-class championship wrestling, aside from the Von Erich family, you know, Brody was the most popular wrestler there.
Fritz went out of his way to help Frank understand the wrestling business. And I think that was a big part of it. He helped him understand if a guy's screwing you around, you've got to stand up to him.
And Fritz is the one who got him booked into All Japan. Japan was really hotter than the United States. You know, it was, All Japan and New Japan were at war. So it was like and you know, they were on network television and everything like that. The money was big before it got big in the United States in that era.
It was the greatest money in the world at the time. It was better than New York. It was better than anybody at that time.
I guess you could just call us high-class hookers because we'd go where the money was, and we did. And they paid us very well compared to here.
When he'd go over there, he'd get the big money.
As soon as Baba got him, Baba put him over really big. I remember like the first tour and everything like that, that it was like, you know, they almost never beat him. I think Baba may have, you know, he may have lost, what, maybe 2 or 3 matches the whole time he was in Japan as far as cleaning pins. They always protected him.
Giant Baba was like Fritz Von Erich. He saw something in Brody and he immediately made him a star.
He understood his character. He understood what a big badass should do, and he protected that character.
The Japanese people, they can see what's going on over there. And they can see through you, or they can understand where you're coming from. And Brody, that's why he appealed to him. He was what he said he was.
Bruiser Brody's wrestling looked real, very convincing. He went out there and he gave his all. As a businessman would, he never laid back.
So before Stan came, Brody and Snuka were the team.
Jimmy Snuka was going to Japan a lot and teaming with Bruiser Brody, and he was at his working peak. He was a little older than people knew. He was a very good partner for Brody.
And that big man, brother, God bless him. Yeah, we were a great team in Japan, bro. It was unbelievable.
And Snuka was the guy that could fight back, could come on the comebacks. The Japanese wrestlers could beat him up and put heat on him, and then Brody could come in the ring and be with him. But they were an excellent team.
Bruiser Brody and Superfly Jimmy Snuka had a great off-stage relationship, but they were tag team partners, they were opponents, and either way, whether they were partners or opponents, they both knew how to work together.
2 strong foreigners, you know, that they didn't want to beat. Like Snuka might have lost every now and then. Brody never lost.
You know, I had the opportunity to go to All Japan because of this war that New Japan actually started, you know, by getting Abdullah to come, and, you know, anyway, who knows what the real story is there. But anyway, there's speculation, you know, whatever. But, you know, anyway, I ended up going to All Japan for Baba, and Frank was already over there.
And they went to the finals of the tag team tournament, and that year, which was one of the most famous matches in All Japan history, that's when Stan showed up and gave Terry Funk the lariat, and Brody pinned, I think it was Dory, to win the tournament, and just this, you know, at the time, this wild and crazy match. And when Stan came, it was Stan and Brody, and they were the unbeatable team.
I think that was kind of like a dream team they'd like to see, or something like that.
Oh, that was huge, and that's what I would venture to say. That's what really made them in the States also, because it came back to the States how much they got over. They got over it like gangbusters, like crazy.
I will never forget the time in the mid-'80s that I was in Japan photographing the matches at ringside, and he was teaming with Stan the Lariat Hansen, and the two of them came out of the dressing room, and I walked into the crowd because I wanted to get a photo of the two of them coming to the ring, and they took out these huge chains and they started swinging the chains around, and the fans in Japan scattered. They were terrified. It was like Godzilla was coming.
When they came through the doors, oh my God, it looked like Moses scattered a bunch of Japanese people. Brody in that chain, Hansen in that yell, and that damn bull rolling through. And it went like woof. I went, God dang. I've never been with, you know, this is the first tour of Japan, and I've never been with two guys like that. And they just scattered people everywhere. And if you got close, you got hit with that daggum cowbell and that chain, and you got too close, you got nailed. They didn't care.
They were just like gods. They were people that came from another world, the United States, and they were bigger than life.
You just can't talk about him without talking about his team with Stan Hansen. They changed Japan, and that, you know, you talk about strong style. You had to fight back against Bruiser Brody to keep his respect and to have the match with him. You had to fight back against Stan Hansen.
When I came over with Frank in that old, you know, not old, that's the wrong term, but it was the NWA type of style. It's a slower, deliberate, you know, holds and so forth. And when I came there, you know, Bob had asked me, you know, anyway, I talked to Bob a few times. I said, well, if I'm coming, I'm not going to change my style. And he says, God, that's what I want. I want your style. So Frank just, you know, he just stepped right in, and there we went. People had to step it up to go and stay in there with us.
Hang on. Those guys were tough. They're both former West Texas State football players. Okay, so Stan Hansen was a middle linebacker. Brody played on defense. Stan's clothesline was not what we think of as a clothesline where you stick an arm out there. He was a middle linebacker coming in and sliding off just to the side and catching you with a shoulder block. I mean, when you took Stan Hansen's clothesline, you knew you were clothesline. The same with Bruiser Brody's drop kick. The same with Bruiser Brody's body slam. The same trying to fight Bruiser Brody on the floor, outside the ring, through the fans, up the aisles. It was a wild and crazy way to go. They were as tough as you get. Watch them to this day and age, and they were very, very physical.
They're a new breed. They're big, athletic guys. They got along well. They had great chemistry. So all those similarities combined made them one of the greatest teams ever.
The ECW style was in Japan before ECW.
They were brutal guys, I mean in a working way. But I'm sure, like I said, if you're in direct competition with them, they could make the night pretty miserable for you in there.
So when they went out there and he was wrestling some young Japanese guy, they literally beat the shit out of the kid. It was, say, almost not a complete 100% shoot, but 80%. They just, and the reason they beat him up is because they could.
You know, we were trying to get on top, and they were trying to keep us down.
This match that Jay Youngblood and myself had in Japan against Bruiser Brody and Stan Hansen, I'm going to say it was in the early 80s, and Youngblood and I found out we're working against these guys, and Jay comes up to me and he goes, "Rick, what are we going to do?" I said, "Jay, don't worry about it." He said, "Those guys are 280 pounds plus 300 pounders. You and I zip around that ring, and after 5 minutes, they'll be so blowed up that then they'll be ours." And he goes, "Makes sense." So we have this match, and it starts, and Youngblood starts, and here comes Brody, and here comes Hansen, and they're beating up on Youngblood. Finally, there's a moment, and I'm standing there in the corner, and Youngblood looks up at me, and just out of the blue, he goes, "Ricky!" I go, "What?" He goes, "They ain't blowing up!"
Hansen and Brody were just a terrifying team. They were terrifying to the opponents, they were terrifying to the fans. They believed what they did, and they didn't hold back.
I think they are probably as responsible for what the Japanese strong style of wrestling as anybody. They laid it in, and they unapologetically would hit you in the mouth. And if you want to hit them in the mouth, have at it. That's what we're going to make sure that everybody leaves here thinking they saw something very extraordinary.
We carved out, you know, a living there for a while where most people weren't going all the time.
He would bring home tapes from Japan, and late at night, he would sit down and he would act like somebody studying a book for their business. All he wanted to do was to give the fans the best night of their life. He wanted them to come out of that building and didn't feel like they'd been cheated.
The Japanese liked them because of the way they wrestled. And of course you had big Japanese stars like Jumbo Tsuruta, like Inoki, like Sakaguchi. People like that, then they would have some pretty stiff matches, but the Brodys understood it, the Babas understood it. It was part of their business.
Bruiser was a true fighter. You could do it the easy way in the ring, or you could get in there with him and do it the hard way.
They called him the intelligent monster.
That came from Japan, and the sports writers gave him that because he was always reading when he was on tour. But his persona was this wild caveman. But out of the ring, they all thought he was really intelligent because he would talk psychology, and he was always, talking to them about things other than wrestling.
He knew how to talk to the Japanese media. And of course, there was more wrestling media in Japan. There was more, there was weekly magazines and daily coverage and all that. And he knew how to be the intelligent monster.
I think they recognized very quickly that, yeah, he's a pretty bright guy. And it kind of surprised you. I think it did. The intelligent monster was really a very accurate nickname for him.
His base was there. Anything else he picked up was gravy, you know what I mean? So it opened him up to do a lot of different things that he wanted to do.
He enjoyed it. That's why he was over there so much. He probably, I'd say if it hadn't been for Japan, he probably would have been in the movies. He was looking after Japan because he figured out all these other things can come afterwards when Japan was over and done. Because he knew Japan, he couldn't go and do the physical work that he did there forever. Because he just gave it all. He gave 100%.
Frank knew he only had a limited amount of time in professional wrestling. It is a very demanding industry on the body. With Frank's commitment to Baba and All Japan being his bread and butter, it made things difficult sometimes for Frank's business dealings back home. My husband was a rebel. He looked out for himself and his fellow wrestlers, hoping that everyone on the same card and himself made money. Professional wrestling was the way he supported his family, and he was out to protect his image in Japan and make every dollar he could. Bruiser Brody was a man unto himself and wasn't afraid to speak out against the business tactics involved with professional wrestling.
That's what his problem was. Frank was the ultimate rebel.
He called his own shots, and he picked his own places to go. And so few people can do that, but he could and did.
And he was very independent. He understood the delicacies of working with a promoter and having to take the promoter's word on every single thing because there's no way to document a lot of stuff, especially the houses, which derived your pay, and it derived all your pay. So he was dubious of the system. and I don't blame him one bit.
Not all of his decisions were wise decisions for the whole of the deal. A lot of them were meant to be toward Frank himself. And there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with taking care of yourself.
Bruiser Brody took care of Bruiser Brody. And in the wrestling business, if you don't take care of yourself, nobody else is going to.
I think it was because he realized that the wrestlers were always getting the short end of the stick.
He questioned things. He was a very intelligent guy. He wanted to know why. And because it was all for him, it was about learning, acquiring information. He was a sponge. Apparently he got hard to work with later on in his career, but I think that's basically a byproduct of his outspokenness, his intellect, and the fact that he caught some guys with their hand in a cookie jar, I'm sure, and he just didn't trust a lot of people. So I don't think he was a inherent malcontent. I just think he was a smart guy that was very observant and saw that I just want my share. I just want the right number, I want my share. That's all, no more, no less.
He was a rebel. I think a rebel because he knew what it would take. He wasn't just about being difficult. He knew how to make money for the boys, and he knew how he could make money for the promoters. He wanted everybody to make money. Not just him, he wanted everybody, and he knew that the visions that he had, he could make the promoters money.
It's not glamorous or exciting, but I think that he was really a rebel in order to feed his family.
He was not just the run-of-the-mill professional wrestler, glad to have a job, pay me what you want. He fought for everything he believed in.
If somebody lied to him one time, that was it. They weren't friends anymore.
Some of these promoters, man, are crooks. I mean, the people will say, oh, well, Brody and other people like this that help the promoter up. I can't blame them sometimes. You know, a guy makes millions of dollars and he want to give you pennies. You know, you got to look out for your family.
You better not go back on 2 cents to Frank. If you tell him you're going to get $100 and 2 cents, you better have the 2 cents ready.
Bruiser beat up and pushed around a lot of promoters.
I seen that man, Bob Geico sitting on the toilet. I seen Brody come, Decatur, Illinois, come through the dressing room wall, the door, straight through the bathroom door, and kicked that door down so hard, hit Bob Geico in the head and knocked him out. You ever call my wife again? I don't know what he did, but hey, that man come through that door, he was serious.
Brody was in it to make money, and I saw him sit down on Gino Hernandez in a cage match in Houston one time, and Gino kept punching Brody in the head, and he wouldn't sell, he wouldn't do anything. So you knew when he was in a bad mood, he would do whatever he wanted.
I'll never forget being in Kansas City. Brody came into Kansas City, Pat O'Connor came up to him to shake his hand. Brody said, "You get away from me. I don't like your kind. I don't want to shake your hand." He had came in because Buck Robley was the booker to do Buck Robley a favor. The one thing about Bruiser Brody, you knew where you stood with him. Either he liked you or he didn't like you.
He embodied not only in the ring, but out of the ring, that outlaw spirit that professional wrestling, to me, is really about. And in good and bad ways, but he was like, you did not mess with him.
A lot of people, whether they admit it or not, like that outlaw. They want to be that outlaw. They want to be the guy that says, I'm not going to screw you, I'm out of here. They want to be that guy.
Dick the Bruiser was and always was Dick the Bruiser. Well, Bruiser Brody went and wrestled over there, and he said, well, I can't call you Bruiser Brody. You're going to be, they think they worked an angle to where it was a battle of the bruisers. Whoever won got to use the name. So they had some matches and stuff like that. They got in a little altercation.
There was some tension between Dick the Bruiser and King Kong Brody, or Bruiser Brody, if you want to call him that. Mostly it came down about payoffs. Dick occasionally had problems counting the house, I think, was kind of how Brody looked at it. And they'd had a couple squabbles in dressing rooms. The big battle was up in Peoria. They had a big fight in a high school dressing room, and they basically wrecked the dressing room. Brody probably got the best of it, but we talked about it one night, and Brody told me, he says, you know, a guy like that, he thinks he's a tough guy, and he's going to screw around with my money. I'm going to fight him. We're going to have a fight. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. I'm going to punch him, and we're going to see what the fight is. He says, but I got to tell you something. I'd have liked to seen him when he was younger, because I'll bet he would have been hell to fight then, because he was a little bit older in those days, so I can't think Frank got the better of it. The ironic thing about that fight, the question about the money went through the business. The question about the fight circulated all around the business. That Friday night at Kiel Auditorium, the following Friday night at Kiel Auditorium, we had them both on a show. Dick the Bruiser and King Kong Brody, ironically on opposite sides of a 6-man tag match. So we're looking for trouble. Dick the Bruiser calls Sam, because I remember because I was in the office and Sam was let me hear the calls. Remember the Bruiser calling Sam, and basically Sam said, Brody says you owe him some money, I understand. And I guess Dick came back with the answer, well, he might have an argument there. Sam says, pay him.
So all of a sudden, it got back to where either the next time or then Dick the Bruiser came around and Brody told me himself, and he went like this, like he had a gun in his hand. But he had the money hanging this way that he owed Bruiser Brody. So Brody got his money, but I guess it was Dick the Bruiser's way of saying, I could have shot you if I wanted to.
Bruiser puts out his hand like this. And in the part where the gun would be, there's the check. He hands that out to Brody. Brody looks at it. Bruiser says, we okay now? Brody says, yep, we're okay.
And there's a famous story with him and Mark Lewin trying to kill San Antonio.
Everything's been built around Bruiser Brody in San Antonio. And Lewin comes in as the madman, the maniac, but Brody's in Japan. So there's no way to have any conflict. Brody comes back, Roby keeps them apart for a little while, however long, a few weeks, way more than a few weeks. Anyway, they build it up to where, Lewin's left broken bodies all over the place. The only man that can handle is Bruiser Brody. We get to San Antonio. One doesn't come out to the ring. He goes back. The other one comes out to the ring. The other one doesn't come back. This went on for 2 or 3 times. Finally, you get both of them in the ring. Brody grabs Lewin in a nerve hold and sits in it for 20, 30, 40 minutes. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. It was at least 20 to 30. It may have been closer to 40. It may have been. They start to fight just a little bit. Next thing you know, Lewin's got Brody, and we're, again, another 20, 30, 40 minutes in a nerve hold. Nothing. And they're barking and hussing at each other. That's all they're doing. Finally got to the point where you could, and this was a good little crowd. This is the best crowd you had seen in San Antonio since the Sheepherders days. And it was getting rough. It was getting dicey in that place. I was there that night, so I remember vividly, it was just getting, but it wasn't that good heat. It was that kind of heat that we're being cheated. We're being, well, this is ridiculous. They left the ring. They just left. And it turns out, I've heard people tell me differently, but when Brody and Roby both tell me that it was through Fritz and Fritz had set it up, I have no reason to doubt them, because Brody was in the office within a couple of weeks. Mark Lewin was back in Japan within a month. Roby showed up in Dallas just a couple of months later. So I have no doubt that it was Fritz. He knew Fred Barron didn't know any different. He knew Fred Barron couldn't do anything about it. What was he going to do if he even wanted to? So they just went in there and they killed, by then it was Texas All-Star. They killed the biggest town.
I wasn't there for that, but I could see Brody and Mark doing that because they were both strong-willed and they both had the same goal. They were going to make more money, and that's what they wanted to do.
Then in Fort Lauderdale is when sort of the infamous shoot match happens.
It seemed like no ordinary night. It was a Florida Championship Wrestling show at the War Memorial Auditorium in Fort Lauderdale.
The way I remember it, Luger had just started, of course, in business, and didn't know too much. And the boys, baby faces in Florida, were telling him, oh my God, Brody's coming in, romping, stomping,
Right.
do anything, capable of anything, just trying to put a scare in Lex.
He was a 6'6" and 315 pounds, solid looking, hair all out everywhere, crazy looking guy. So they didn't have to build him up much. He was a big, scary looking guy, so I was very nervous working with him. And to get into, and I'd never had a cage match before. So we're in a cage in Fort Lauderdale after a whole day of TV in Tampa. We drove all the way across Florida to get to Fort Lauderdale, and we're in a cage match. I had no idea what I was going to do, and we were separate locker rooms, so we couldn't talk.
Lex Luger was about to go to WCW. He was like in his last week, and Brody came in and they wanted Brody to beat Lex Luger, and Luger said, I can't lose to him.
We get in the match, and a few minutes in, I'm of course totally clueless what I'm doing in there, and I never got the full story from him. He talked to me afterwards, but he just stopped working. Stood there, looking at me, real scary. So I'm like, I look at Fonz and go, what do we do? He goes, I go, what's going on, Fonz? What do we do? He goes, man, and Fonz was a very experienced guy. He goes, I don't know, man, I don't know. I go, I don't know what to do. I don't know what's going on. I go, you don't know what's going on? So I didn't know whether it was part of the match or what.
Brody was kind of told by Matsuda, to just, he wouldn't do a job for you. So he just kind of like teach him a lesson type of a thing.
I kind of tried to lock up with him back in the corner and hit him a couple times, and he wouldn't sell, but he wouldn't fire back really. He just stood up straight and just looked at me, crazy looking. Now I'm really scared.
And Luger has no idea. He just knows I am in here with a guy who could kick my ass anytime he wants to, and he knows it. So he can't figure it out.
So I look at Fonzie. I go, Fonzie, what do we do? He goes, brother, just keep on punching him. I'll grab your arm. He goes, sling me. He goes, sling me back. He goes, I'll get up and you keep on hitting him. And I'll DQ you. He rang the bell, and then Gordon was the guy's name. He was the ring guy. He couldn't get the cage door open. Now Fonzie are taking it upon ourselves to end the cage match. I don't know what's going on in Brody's head. He's in there with tape around all his fingertips with razor blades on them, staring at me. And I'm like, I literally, the cage is supposed to keep us in. When Gordon couldn't get the door open, like a scared rabbit, I jumped up on the ropes and climbed out of the cage. Went back to the locker room.
At the time, I didn't realize that we may have just seen a historical match.
My heart's racing. And so once I calmed down, I'm like, man, I guess if I'm going to get beat up or whatever's going to happen, I'm going to go over and find out, make this a learning experience. I'll go over, I knocked real softly on the door. Everybody else is pretty much gone. I saw off to the side, I saw Brody pulling his stuff off in his boots and sitting in a chair, and Engelbert Humperdinck was sitting closer by, and he saw me knocking the door, and he goes, let's go in. I'm like, okay. I walked in, and I go, is it okay if I talk to him? He goes, yeah. And Brody said, yeah, man. He goes, he was actually very nice. He just said, look, I'm on a new push down with the Von Erichs in Texas. They're making me into a good guy because you're going in already advertised on TV. It was the very end of my last few weeks in Florida. He goes, and you're going to be one of the horsemen, and they're a bad guy group because we had a long day. He goes, you're experienced in the cage. He goes, and it just wasn't working.
Luger told me that after the match they talked and everything was fun. It was climbing around, it was a big rib, big joke. But other people say that the way that Coliseum is shaped, there's no way that they talked after the match, and Luger just took off, left the cage, up the aisle, and left the arena.
I can tell you his story of him going to the opposite side never happened.
Never liked the man at all. Very selfish. He would come into a territory. He had a mentality where he wanted to stick it to the promoters. So what he would do is he would screw up matches purposely or try to destroy business. Right. But he didn't realize there was a guy in that first match that was maybe making $50 that needed that to pay his car payment or maybe a child support payment someplace. And if Bruiser Brody kills that business, that takes that poor guy out of $50. And I believe when you're a top guy, you owe something to everybody on that card. To be professional and to make sure that you do it right. If you don't want to work for the guy, tell him that. But don't screw the other guys on the card, because they got to come back next week. You don't.
It's easy to point the finger at other people, but I don't know very many big-name wrestlers that you can fuck over and they come back with a smile on their face. The difference with Bruiser Brody, he would beat the shit out of you. Bruiser Brody would get right in your face and punch you. Right. That was the difference. Brody was a man's man. If you treated Brody with respect, he showed you nothing but respect in return.
His bread and butter was Japan. So number one, where it made it harder is like, he wasn't going to lose in the United States. And a lot of people would get mad about it, but it was like, well, he wasn't, Stan wasn't. They just weren't going to get pinned because you had those Japanese reporters there. And Baba would have been furious if he's paying these guys what he was paying them. For them to lose, it had to be on his you know, on his shows. And he didn't want him to lose very often either because he was paying him so much. So it was one of those things where he wanted those guys protected.
Frank was one of those guys that took care of Frank first and then looked after you second.
It was a thinking man's wrestler. But you never knew what he was going to do. He didn't have set, move. He just to abandon, just go crazy.
He was a smart, independent thinking guy that in that era, a lot of guys were afraid to open their mouth. And he was not intimidated or afraid of anything.
He was a huge man. He was an intelligent man. He had a great deal of personal charisma, and he leveraged that to establish himself into a position where he was an outlaw and he could travel around and go where he wanted. He had a great deal of freedom to be where he wanted, when he wanted, and he drew a great deal of money. But it was really just to feed his family. A lot of other wrestlers, I think, resented him. A lot of them probably envied him.
When a man goes in the ring, works his ass off, right? When he's finished, he wants what? He wants money. You couldn't go to Brody or come to me and say, oh, the people snuck in tonight. You couldn't do that to us. We made sure that the promoters paid us. And if I've never put my hands on a promoter, but if they were trying to shaft, Brody, Brody said, wait a minute, you can't treat me like this.
In the ring, he took care of business. He knew what Bruiser Brody had to do for Bruiser Brody and for longevity. And that's why he was on top as long as he was, because he knew how to take care of business.
They wanted him to do exactly what they wanted, and he had his limits of what he was going to do, so it was tough. And then sometimes, if he got mad at him, there were all kinds of things, whether it be walking out on shows or, whatever. I mean, he could find a reason to be mad, but he usually had the reason first.
Sometimes he'd come home sooner than what he was meant to, and that's because, he had a little falling out with the promoter. It was when they wanted something that he knew would hurt not just him, but the business.
If you kept your word to Frank, he would go up above and beyond the call of duty. It's only when these guys didn't keep their word to him that he wanted what you told him that you were going to give him, like everybody else, but he would press the issue.
He was a wrestling rebel that was big enough and strong enough to get away with it, and box office attraction enough to get away with it.
With Frank's schedule in Japan keeping him busy enough and picking up as much work here in the States as he could in between tours, it's no surprise he was on the road wrestling in Kansas City and St. Louis when I gave birth to our son Jeff on November the 7th, 1980.
I still remember the day Jeffrey was born, Jeffrey Goodish, his son. He was coming in from Kansas City and driving in. And when I got to we had a whole hotel office. We always had our offices in hotels. When I got in, the gal was at the desk, and she said, there's a message here for King Kong Brody that his wife just went to the hospital. She's in labor. Well, when Brody got in, he got the message. He comes up to the office, and of course, he's going to ask, can he get off the show that night? Before he can say anything to Sam Muchnick, Sam says, why are you still here? You should be on a plane. Go back home and be with your wife. She's having a baby.
Frank flew home right away and got in late on Friday, and he had to leave the next day for a show and wasn't coming home until Monday. When he finally got home, he had to leave again for another show. But once he was home, he couldn't stop staring at our son. We both couldn't stop staring. Having Jeff changed Frank's life.
He was a family man all the way. He never stopped talking about his wife and his son constantly.
Down deep, yes. Yeah, that was just everything to him.
He invited me to his home in Texas to visit with his lovely wife Barbara and their young son Jeffrey back then, and they took me to the Texas State Fair. And he was the nicest husband and nicest daddy you'd ever want to meet. And people would come over to him and say, oh, can I have an autograph? Oh, certainly. He was just the opposite outside of the business.
He was a fighter and a tough guy and all that, but he loved his wife and his son. He loved them. He was a family man. He saved money. He put money back and bought a home for him. He loved his family and took care of his family.
He also had some teddy bear in him. When my daughter was probably 4, 5, 6 years old, and she was just starting to play around with softball and throw the ball, and a couple of times we had times to stop at the house before we go to a show, an independent show somewhere with Herb in the Illinois or Missouri area. We'd stop at the house, Brody go in the backyard, and he'd play catch with her. And it was like, you know, like big brother.
When he went to Japan, I mean, it was 6 weeks at a time sometimes. Then he was always on the road here. Sometimes it would be like, for example, Christmas. He'd be home Christmas Eve. We would get the, you know, everything all on the tree. Him and his son would decorate the tree. Get up in the morning, open the presents, get in the car probably about 12 o'clock, maybe go to a hotel for Christmas dinner and straight to the airport. And he was gone. It was just one of those schedules you never knew. So when he did get home, he'd try to do things with Jeff. When he came home, we had a place, the gates were locked, and only people that he knew would get in. And that was his downtime, his place where he could just relax, be who he was. When we used to drop him off at the airport, you could see the difference. He'd get out of the car, he'd be Frank. As soon as you saw him walk through the airport doors, his walk changed, take his hair out, his whole demeanor. He became Bruiser Brody on that side of the door. He was entirely different. This side of the door, he was still Dad. But he knew how to keep the two separate. Because he knew that once he was out there, he was that character.
Many sides to that personality, many sides that he never got credit for, unfortunately.
Bruiser knew that I had 4 sons, and he started talking to me about his son. And his son, I think, was 5 or 6 at the time. And he said, I just drove my son down through Detroit slums. He said, I wanted them to see how these people live so he'd realize what a life he was going to have because of his reputation and the money he was making.
Having a son put wrestling into perspective for Frank. He already knew the value of $1, but now he was preparing for his family's future. And that's why he fought for every dollar he was owed and made sacrifices while out on the road.
That's why if anybody messed with the money that he felt he should make, or that he knew the house was this size, or that there was a guarantee, if there was a guarantee, hey, I've guaranteed you $750. You walk in, you give him $750, you're going to get the best he can give you.
Bruiser Brody was this way. In his bag, he had his black trunks, his fur boots, and he had a couple of cans of tuna and perhaps a can of pork and beans and a can opener in there.
They were put into his boots to keep his boots home. So I'd wrap him up and put the tuna and green beans, one in each pair of boots. Because a lot of times there were no places open after the matches and that. And of course, a lot of it was fast food, not good food, and he knew he had to get that protein. The tuna and green beans would give him the protein that he needed to half repair the body after being so physical. You know, you do that and then you go eat bad food and then the body starts breaking down.
I've seen him eat a can of green beans and bring apples in the dressing room. So he was pretty frugal.
After I got my work done at the office, usually we'd stop somewhere and eat, usually a steak place or something like that, or at least get hamburgers or pizza or something. I said, hey, you want to go? And he said, no, he said, that's okay. He says, I'm going to go and he said, I'm going to have my tuna. And he pulled out his can, showed me his tuna can. Okay, if that works for you, made you 300 pounds, something did it.
Another moment that made Frank realize life was short was the death of his close friend, David Von Erich.
He and Joe Higuchi, who was the famous referee for Japan, they went to the hotel to look why David Von Erich hadn't shown up at the match that night. It was, I think, David's first tour to Japan. And David had just gone through some very difficult times. His wife and he had had a baby who died 3 months old. Something with the way he was sleeping or whatever, but he had died 3 months old. And then David broke up with his wife. So he was having a very hard time. He was having a lot of pain problems because of all the travel and all the bumping he took, and then the way he worked in wrestling, and working in Japan, which was very stiff. So that probably played a part in it. But Frank told me, he called me from Japan when it happened, because he knew I was tight with David too. And he said, at that point, don't tell anybody, but it doesn't matter now. He said, I went in with Higuchi, we found David laying there, we found pills. Now, did he take the pills intentionally? Was he drinking and just took too many pills? We don't know. And anybody who says they know, they're full of it. Because they don't know, they weren't in Japan either. All I know is I talked to Brody, he was there, and Brody says, I don't know if it was a mistake, an accident, or intentional. It could have been any of them. But the one thing then that Brody did when he found the pills, he took the remaining pills that were there, he put them in the toilet, flushed them down the toilet.
I think it changed him because all of a sudden and this was after Jeff was born, so he did have a son too, that you realize how precious life is. He was already planning on life after wrestling. He knew that his body at some point was going to break down.
As Frank got older and wiser with the wrestling business, he began to go and work anywhere and everywhere he could in the States if the money was right. Bruiser Brody became the first independent wrestling superstar of his generation.
He was one of the first independents that went around and did for all the big name stuff.
Herb started running some shows, independent shows with local guys, and he was doing pretty well with them. And I think part of it was that St. Louis wasn't running as many cards because now we were working with WWF. The shows were different, there weren't as many. It didn't have the local flavor that it once had before. And Brody still had his towns that he could go into, and he could even come into St. Louis once in a while what was left of the St. Louis Wrestling Club, which really was more Jim Crockett. Crockett was running a lot of St. Louis at that point. And one time I was with Herb, and I guess the thought just popped into my head. I said, hey, what do you think about having Brody come in for a show sometime?
We were doing a show at the Belle Claire Fairgrounds, and we were doing pretty good there, but Larry would come by periodically, and I remember I'm standing looking out of the dressing room, and he's standing behind me, and he says, hey, what would you think about bringing Frank in here? And I said, never, it will never happen.
After Herb got off the floor, I said, well, now the bad part, you want to hear what he's going to cost? But he did a great job, and he lived up to his promise of what he's going to pay Brody, and Brody came, and it worked. And we just kind of, the more we did it, he kind of found out that because he'd been on TV so much, not only could he do it here in the St. Louis area, he could do it in the Indianapolis area. He could do it in Texas. He could work independent shows if you could find a promoter who understood the business, who was honest, and who would make sure that you come up with some money, the money that's promised you come up with. So he started doing that.
He'd walk into a dressing room and say, what do you want tonight, big boy? And I'm thinking, now here I am, a little bitty Herb Simmons, a promoter just enjoying this dream, and a guy like Bruiser Brody asking me what I want him to go out there and do, and I tell him, send him home happy, and he always did.
You needed a star to build around the card, and when we put the card together, we'd usually try to have a good star for Brody to work with. We'd have a couple good hands who were very good professionals, Spike Huber, Steve Regal underneath them. And then we'd use the local guys who were just breaking in.
You could book Bruiser Brody on your show, find an opponent for him, Abdul the Butcher, the classic opponent, or just anybody, really. And Brody on that show by itself, you had a chance to make money on the show. People would come that would not, a lot of people would come who would not have come to your show, but you had Brody. They go, we're gonna see a fight, we're gonna see this guy's gonna kick ass, and you were guaranteed to see that. And so you could put, the rest of the show could be, lower priced talent.
He was still the guy that people brought in to pop a crowd.
The greatest independent guy, for sure. You know, I mean, he made a really good living out of being an independent and catering to nobody.
When Larry introduced me to another aspect of the business with the Frank, with Bruiser Brody, and then it just kind of escalated. Along with him came the Dick Murdochs, Crusher Blackwells, Greg Valentines, people like that just really put us up a little bit higher on the bar.
He drew money, so he never lacked for a place to go because somebody would be hurt and they'd say, well, we can get Brody. Oh God, not him. Yeah, he'd come in and draw nothing but money.
Every time he came, there were more people in the building. He drew money. In the end, a lot of the places that asked him back were towns that didn't have consistent drawing power. So you bring in Brody, we're gonna draw better. So you had to live with it.
They were having some really good little promotions. They were just starting small, and I think it would have worked. And everybody was happy. All the boys were making money, the promoters were making money. He didn't want to be the one making all the money and nobody else get any. He wanted to share. He wanted everybody to be happy, because that's how you have a good business.
He was not wanting to work a full-time schedule for the Crockett's or for the WWF or really anybody else. He still was going in Japan. So to pick up independent dates and, you know, this is my price, you pay my price, I'll be there and we'll make something work. He was really important to that first wave of independent promoters who were not under the monopoly of the NWA, WWF, AWA.
Your biggest guys in Japan was Abdullah the Butcher, Stan Hansen, and Bruiser Brody. That was your big guns. And then two newer young guys finally come in that the Japanese people loved them. And they become instantly first tour up there with Abdullah, Stan, and Bruiser, and that was the Road Warriors.
There was a major wrestling war. It was in primetime television. It was everybody's grandfather and hero, Giant Baba, versus the national hero, Antonio Inoki, and he was a very prime piece of talent for that. But I think he pushed his luck as far as getting better deals. Maybe one time too many, and he had to kind of, he kind of had to go back, and the Road Warriors were getting bigger. He wasn't the most, here's these young badasses for the time of the Road Wars, and here's Bruiser Brody, and he's been around for a while, and I think, I'm sure it hurt his pride.
I think that the feeling was the Road Warriors just came in, and the Road Warriors were getting the same money he was, and I think he thought, I've been here for years and years and years, and the Road Warriors came in, and New Japan was looking for something, so it all kind of happened at the same time, and they offered him way more money, and so he made the jump, and it was huge. The first Inoki Brody match was gigantic. I mean, they didn't have a Tokyo Dome then, but that would have been like a Tokyo Dome giant, house match.
Yeah, I think he was making $10,000 a week from All Japan. Then when Inoki made the offer, it was $14,000 a week, which was whoa, $14,000 a week. That's pretty serious money, for 20 weeks a year. You're doing pretty good there.
He came to me, and he says, they give me a hell of a deal, and what I said, I probably not going to say, but anyway, it didn't work out for him.
When he made the jump from All Japan to New Japan, that was like a major baseball player in the United States leaving one major team for another team. I mean, it was every newspaper in Japan had it all over the front page of the sports page in every newspaper in Japan. The news was that big.
So that's why he jumped over there, but then he found out, with all due respect to Inoki, that the company wasn't run as efficiently, as smoothly as Giant Baba's company was.
He went ahead and went, and that was he ran into some problems right off the bat. I'm not divvy to all that. I don't know, but it didn't work out.
Inoki was obsessed with getting that win over Brody, and Brody was obsessed with not giving him that win.
The problem with him and Inoki was, in the end, neither trusted the other one, because they could have made the program, go back and forth with each winning, but Inoki insisted on the first win because he didn't trust that if he lost the first one that Brody would give it back. And Brody wasn't going to lose the first one because he didn't think Inoki would give it back. And then when they wanted to do a 2 out of 3 fall match, there was talk about, we'll do a 2 out of 3 fall match and we'll go to a draw and we'll each get a fall. And neither one would agree to lose the first fall because they were afraid the other one would run away, and double cross them on the second fall. So it was extreme paranoia, and he wasn't going to lose to Inoki unless Inoki lost to him first. And yeah, so it was like a stalemate.
And then when you compared Baba to Inoki, you found out that with Inoki, well, the bus wasn't always on time, this wasn't always right, there was always an argument about a finish on something, and a lot of arguments on finishes, which caused a problem. So eventually, he decided he would have to go back to Bob. He would eventually go back to Bob, or he'd just leave Inoki.
He lost his deal for a while, and we were in Dallas. He was pretty mad because he said, I invited them people to my home. More than just a business relationship.
Well, what happened is that when it didn't work out with Inoki, he kind of burns the bridge with All Japan. So he was out of Japan. We spent a number of hours talking about when you've had a really good job in Japan, then all of a sudden you do something and you lose that job, and then he's still got a living to make and everything else. So he ended up going out and hustling like crazy, going to all these independent things.
Brody was a free spirit, and he, at some point he says, I can do what I want to do. But that was part of his persona.
Somehow they all made peace at the end, and he ended up going back to Baba.
Baba took him back, but Baba wanted to push him down the card a little bit more. And also he was in his 40s by that point.
It's ironic, when he went back to Baba, he told me, he says, I know right away, he said, I'm going to have to do a big favor for one of his stars early. He's going to want me to prove why I'm here. And when he came back, it was for Jumbo Tsuruta. And he lost to Jumbo. We had talked about the finish in the match probably half a dozen times. And then he got a tape of it, and he sent me the tape right away. He says, what do you think? Do you think I did it right? And it was something off of a Greco-Roman back body drop. He took the bump backwards, and he took a big bump for Tsuruta, who he respected greatly. And the finish made sense. And that was what was important.
When he came back, they were going to do, right before he died, they were just starting the Brody Stand program. They were going to go against each other, and that would have been huge.
Some matches are best not to happen. Some matches get better in time if we just, through the theater of the mind. And I don't have any issues being able to daydream about how Stan Hansen versus Bruiser Brody would have been. It would have been cool. That would have been a match that I probably would have, I won't say this about many, but I probably would have called that one for nothing.
I think he was glad to get back in at the very end. Baba, being Baba, asked Frank to come back, or I think it's probably the other way around. But Baba brought him back, and that worked out all right, And then of course he got murdered.
When Frank lost his Japanese tours for a short time before going back to work for Baba, he and Stan made trips to Puerto Rico for Carlos Colon's World Wrestling Council, where they had the biggest matches in the island's history, opposite Colon and Abdullah the Butcher.
Frank and I had been going to Puerto Rico together, and I got hit with a big rock in my cheek, and it's just lucky I didn't. And I said, I don't know. I just decided. But Frank was the type of guy that he was really into the business, He was into the wrestling business.
Puerto Rico was one of the places that you wanted to work. You can't beat the weather. Weather was beautiful. You always had big, big crowds. They drew big money there in Puerto Rico. And it was a summer vacation.
It was paradise, but it was very, very dangerous.
Working in Puerto Rico at that time, during the 70s and 80s was, especially the 80s, I mean, Puerto Rico was on fire.
Puerto Rican at the time was notorious for wild stuff. That was their style. The wilder, the better.
Frank never had mentioned any trouble from the office or anyone. In July of 1988, I was pregnant again, and Jeff and I were planning to join Frank on this trip to Puerto Rico. Unfortunately, I had a miscarriage, and we agreed it would be better if Jeff and I stayed behind so I could rest. Then on July the 16th, 1988, our world changed forever.
I really wouldn't like to go into it because I don't know really much of it. The only thing I knew that they had differences before.
Well, a day that will stay in my mind forever.
I was staying in the Tanama Hotel, and Frank, Bruiser Brody was at the Blue Lagoon, and he had asked me and Butch, my roommate, Butch Cassidy was a midget, and he asked us to come over and eat lunch with him right before we went over to have the big show. And so we went over to eat with him, and we were sitting there having a early dinner or late lunch with him, and we were talking, and the thing that strikes me odd the most is he reached across the table and held my hand. I'd known Brody for years, and he told me some buddies to remember the most important things in life are God and family. And it kind of took me aback because, I mean, I'd known him forever. He never talked about God, and he rarely talked about his family. It's like he had a premonition he was going to die, my opinion.
Bruiser Brody was sitting on the hotel steps, him and Dutch Mantel. It was kind of late because the guy was, he picked me up late. So I was wondering why was Brody still there. So I said, Brody, aren't you on the show tonight? Are you working? He said, yeah, I'm working. I said, what you waiting for? He said, I'm waiting for my ride. I said, who is that? He said, Jose. Jose's supposed to pick him up that day. He rode with Jose the whole week. I said, well, if you want to, I said, you and Dutch could go with me. I said, the owner of the gym, I said, the gym we went to this morning, I said, he's going to take me to the gym, so he'd be by here. So the guy at the Brody said, okay, if he don't mind me going with him, I'll go with him. I said, well, let me tell the front desk, if Jose shows up, I want to tell the front desk that you going with me. Brody said, oh, thank you, man, I appreciate it. We got to the building.
And when I walked in, there was Carlos, and there was Invader, who was the guy who actually had the altercation with Brody. And I don't know what it was about Puerto Rico, but I always felt tension there.
I don't know why it didn't dawn on me. It didn't dawn on Brody, it didn't dawn on nobody. When we got to the building, Jose was at the building. Now he's supposed to pick Brody up, but he's at the, he's at the building and buy your own.
I felt something that wasn't right. This was like, something was wrong, and I couldn't tell you what it was. So I said, I got to get out of here. I thought to myself, and I got up and I left.
I noticed it was Carlos Colon, Jose, and Victor DeRico was like in a football huddle, talking. As soon as we walked through the door, I remember out the corner of my eye, I saw Jose get up, walk out of the dressing room. So Jose was gone, and then Brody came over to see, he said, Tony, you draw? Well, he said, what you doing? I said, look, I showed him the picture. He go, wow, that's good. He said, I didn't know you could do that. I said, yeah, I've been doing this my whole life. And he said, I wonder if you could do me a favor. He said, we're gonna be here for another 2 or 3 days. He said, do you mind doing a picture of my son? You want me to draw his son? So I said, sure. So he reached in his pouch. He pulled out a picture of his son. When he done that, Jose walked up behind him. Said, Brody, real nice night, very nice. Said, Brody, can I talk to you? Brody, I'm sitting in the chair just like I'm sitting now. He said, can I talk to you for a minute? Well, I'm about I would say I'm maybe 3 to 4 feet from the shower. My chair was sitting right in front of the shower. As I'm sitting there, Brody reached in to get the picture. And Jose come up, and I noticed out of the corner of my eye, he got a towel
in his hand, a towel. So, you know, wrestlers carry towels all the time. You know, who's going to pay any attention to it? He set his wrestling bag down. He had a pouch in one hand, the picture of his son in the other hand. Jose walked through the shower door. Brody walked in right behind him. As soon as Brody put one foot in the shower door, I hear this. A little rumbling. So I dropped the pad. I jumped up to rush the door to see what the hell is going on. I saw the sucker stab, but I thought he was using his fist. You know, because Brody is a big man, so I couldn't see Jose. He was being stabbed. I didn't know. So as soon as I got, I would say 12 inches from the door, Carlos Colon cut me off. Shot right in the shower. And he grabbed Jose and pushed Jose up against the wall. And he go, no, Jose, no, Jose. And I looked up and I saw the knife in Jose's hand. Brody was bent over like this. I grabbed him around the waist to yank him out of the shower, and his intestine fell across my arm. And he said, Tony, don't let him hurt me. I'm hurt. Don't let him hurt me no more. Don't let him hurt me no more. I said, Brody, ain't nobody gonna do nothing to you. I said, I'm going back and I said, I'm gonna break his, I'm gonna say it. I said, I'm gonna break his fucking neck. So I went to get Jose. Carlos stopped me. Tony, it's over. That between them two. Don't get involved. I said, call the mother. Tony, it's over. Go see about your friend. So I went back to see about Brody. Brody laying on the floor.
When we went into that room, what happened had already happened, yeah.
So I said, well, I'll go back to the dressing room, I thought. So back through the tunnel I went. And right when I got to the top of the steps, and it was probably a 15-second walk. It was right there. But you got to go through a tunnel, and it's about 30, 40 feet maybe. And right when I went up some steps, I heard a lot of commotion going on, like in the dressing room area, like some loud voices, and I came around the corner. And the first guy I saw was Mark Youngblood, and I says, hey man, what's going on? He says, Jose stabbed Brody. I went, what? He said, Jose stabbed Brody. And I still didn't get it, because I'm in Puerto Rico, everybody and his brother is named Jose. It's like Joe. And I said, what are you saying? He said, Invader stabbed Brody. And to say I was stunned, I mean, I'm still not processing this. I walked through the 6 or 8 steps, and I see Brody laying on the floor. Invader stayed in the shower, and when all this happened, they had an owner down there named Victor Jovica. And when I got back there, they were both in the shower, and I heard Jovica screaming at him, and he was screaming back. But they were screaming in Spanish, so I couldn't tell you what they said.
Carlos said, let me talk to him. I said, don't you come over here. I said, you come over here, I'm gonna knock you out. So Brody said, let him over. So he come over with Brody laying on the floor, and he looked at Carlos Colon. He said, Carlos, do me a favor. If I don't make it, take care of my family.
To see this in a wrestling dressing room, you know, our dressing room is our sanctuary. That's where we run to get away from the problems. And now it was just unfolding right in front of me. And there was Brody, you know, he's a big guy laying there and he's hurt.
Now, nobody saw what happened but me. Nobody saw it.
I was in the Hill dressing room, and we was in a baseball stadium, and they were on the other side. And I remember the doctor first coming in and said that he first told us that Brody had bumped his head and was bleeding real bad. And then about 30 minutes later, he come in and said that a fan stabbed him.
So a little while later, they come back again and they start talking again. Cheeky goes over and listens again. Cheeky comes over and says, hey, it was Brody. They said that Brody got in a fight in the dressing room and that he fell against the porcelain sink and cut himself. So I says, Cheeky, tell him we want to know what in the hell's going on now. By now, everybody, all the guys in the dressing room, not just me, everybody wanted to know what was going on. So we went out to the dugout down below, and looked across to the heel babyface side, and I looked over there, and Dutch was signaling me something, and I couldn't figure out what he was signaling me. And I thought, what the hell's going on? And then there was Dutch, just a couple other guys in the dugout. Excuse me. And I thought, So me and Dan go back up into the dressing room, and we're sitting there. Finally, Mateo comes over again. When he comes over again, I said, Cheeky, I said, you asked this piece of shit what the hell's going on. I said, something's going on that we don't know about. And so then that's when they said that Brody had been stabbed, but they said he had been stabbed by a fan.
I didn't believe it. I didn't believe it. I thought that they were working an angle. You know what I mean? That's what I thought. When they said, Brody got stabbed or Brody this and stuff like that, I said, yeah, okay. You see what I mean? Until the doctor came over and said that Brody was holding his stomach. And I said, is this serious? What the hell's going on?
Finally, the third time the doctor came, Dr. Hernandez was his name. The third time he come in, he told us that Jose Gonzalez had stabbed him.
I never thought that, that thing was going to take place, because I would have stopped it.
So finally, the way they got an ambulance there, I think the owner of the company, Victor, he owned another company later. He was working for Carlos Colon. He actually knew some people at the radio station, and they put out a call over the air. We need an ambulance, emergency vehicle at B. Thorne Stadium immediately.
45 minutes later, Brody laid on that floor for about 45 minutes. Finally, the ambulance came. Finally. So it was an old man and a woman. So they got Brody on the girder. And the old man bent down, he tried to pick Brody up, and the woman tried to pick Brody up. And they couldn't do it. So they turned. Now this is where I really learned what pro wrestling was all about. This is where I learned all about wrestling. The old man turned to the wrestlers and said these words, can one of y'all help? He's heavy, we can't lift him into the ambulance. The wrestlers they turned their back and started acting like they're lacing up their boots.
So you can imagine sitting in a dressing room, watching a man literally dying in front of you and nobody doing anything. I mean, we couldn't do anything. We had a doctor there. I mean, what could we do but kind of pray for him?
So I walked over, I reached under that girder, and I'm not trying to blow my own horn, but at that time I was able to bench press 650 pounds, squat 800, and clean and jerk 420 pounds. I could put 420 pounds over my head. So I was a pretty rugged SOB. So I grabbed Brody and I picked him up, and with the girder. The wheels never came down. I didn't need no wheels. I picked the whole dadgum thing up and I put him in the broom. When I picked him up, he said, brother, don't drop me. I said, brother, I curl more than you weigh. And he started laughing a little bit. So I slid him on the girder. So they were getting ready to leave. The lady said, if someone want to go with him, you can, if one of y'all want to go with him. The wrestlers turned it back again. So me and Brody, I took him to the hospital.
Now before they took him out, I remember this, Invader, he left the dressing room, the shower, and went out into the dressing room and walked around Brody and grabbed where his bag was, grabbed his keys and left. So after they took Brody out, 45 minutes later, an hour, whatever it was, and he came back and continued business as usual.
So finally, we get to the hospital. I'm sat there, 5 minutes go by, 10 minutes go by, 15 minutes went by, now I done lost it. I said, where's the doctor? So this doctor had his paper. I said, are you a doctor? Yes. He put back the paper. I grabbed him like that, put him up on my shoulders. like this. Where you we go? I said, we're going to see my friend. And I pat him on my shoulder just like this, you know. I carried him in there with Brody. Brody was laying on the beds they got there, and he had his hand on his stomach like this. The doctor said, well, put me down so I can see your friend. Cause I said, you ain't gonna run out. And he said, no. He said, just please put me down. So I put him down, and he asked Brody, said, how you doing? And Brody said, I'm just waiting for you to help me, brother. So he lifted Brody's hand like this, and just a pool of blood. I mean, just, you know, you never seen so much blood. So I looked at that, and I started getting a little teary-eyed. And the doctor said, well, we need to get him into operation right away. He said, we need to get him in there right away. And I said, okay. So he started calling for people to do things, and I took Brody's shoes off so he could be comfortable, and his feet was blue. I gotta admit, I started crying. I said, doctor, please get him in there. Come on, doc, please get him in there. I said, don't let this man die. He said, we're gonna do all we can for your friend. So he take him into the room. So I'm sitting outside the emergency room there, and the guy comes out. He said, you can leave now. We got your friend stable. He said, we got one of his intestines sewed back together. And he said, we got him, he's stable now. And I said, you sure he's all right? He said, yeah, he's stable. So I get back to the show in Bayamon. And before I opened up the dressing room door, I hear all this laughing and joking and kicking up the heel, and everybody just having a wonderful freaking time. The blood from Bruiser Brody have not dried on the floor yet, and everybody's in the dressing room congratulating each other what a wonderful match they're having. It was a policeman was in the dressing room, and I seen Jose laughing and joking with Carlos, like nothing happened. So the police come up to me and said, are you the one that took Brody to the hospital? I said, yeah, I took him to the hospital. He said, did you get a look? Did you get a look at the fan that stabbed him? I said, what you talking about? He said, well, everybody in here said Brody got stabbed all the way to the dressing room by one of the fans. You understand what I'm saying? I told the policeman, I said, he didn't get stabbed by no fan. And he said, well, did you see who stabbed him? I said, yes, I did. He said, well, who stabbed him? I said, that's him right there, Jose. He said, you mean Vader? I said, yeah, he stabbed him. He said, you gotta be kidding me. He said, everybody in the dressing room said a fan did it. I said, everybody in the dressing room lied to you. I said, he did it.
They thought it was an angle. They thought it was a crazy angle.
I remember Jose looking right up at me like he wanted to kill me. And he got up and left.
I go to the hotel where we were staying, and I tell the lady at the desk, I said, if Brody gets any calls, because I thought his wife would call, because I didn't think that since he's in the hospital, he hadn't called her. And I know she knew where he was. I said, if Brody gets any calls, I said, put the call through to my room.
And the phone started ringing. Well, it just kept on. We had an agreement. If the phone rings, it's not going to be him. Don't answer the phone. And this was, you have to remember, there was no cell phones, there was no answering machines, there was just a phone. So it kept ringing and ringing. I mean, it rang for about an hour on and off. So finally, I picked up the phone to give whoever was on the phone a piece of my mind. Well, it was this lady, which we would get calls from different ladies. Anyone in the public eye will tell you that that goes with being in the public eye. And she just informed me that there had been an accident and that maybe I should, get on a plane and come to Puerto Rico. And I said, well, what kind of accident? She said, well, I can't really go into that now, but, I think you should maybe come down here. Okay, hang up. Boy, this is some prank. Somebody wants me to get on the plane, go down. I could just imagine. But being who I am, I thought, well, I better just check it out, just in case, on that one little thing. So I called his hotel room.
The phone rings about 5 o'clock in the morning, and it's Brody's wife, Barbara. She says, what is going on? And I can't remember the exact conversation now, but I said, well, and I'm trying not to alarm her unduly. I said, well, there's been a little bit of an accident. You know, Brody's in the hospital, Bruiser's in the hospital. And she said, well, how is he? I said, well, I think he's gonna be fine, but I think you should get here as quick as you can.
And I said, well, what do you think? He said, well, if you can, why don't you just come down? I said, is he okay? Well, of course, nobody knew anything at that point.
And that was about 5 o'clock in the morning. So I got up the next morning about 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, because I can't sleep anyway. And I go downstairs, and the same girl who was there the night before, she was still there. I guess they worked 10 or 12-hour shifts, but she was still there. And I says, and she spoke English. She was a Puerto Rican girl, but she had grown up in Chicago. So she spoke really, really good English, and very pretty girl and very nice. And I said, can you do me a favor? And I forgot, I knew her name, so I called her by the name. I said, can you do me a favor? Can you call Central Medico and check on my friend Bruiser Brody? And she says, yeah. She called out there, and then she's talking in Spanish, and then she started crying. And I went, that wasn't a good sign for me. And she hung the phone up and she said, I'm sorry, your friend died last night. That's hard to hear. Because yesterday he was fine, and today, now he's not with us. And I go out on the street and what do you do?
Next morning, Abdullah the butcher, he called a meeting. He said, somebody need to go do something, you know. He said, I got to talk to his wife. His wife is on her way. You know, they're going to fly her in. So I said, they said, well, I didn't see nothing. Dusty, I didn't see it. Dusty, I went to check the people. And the young blood said, well, I didn't see it either. So everybody said they didn't see nothing. So I said, well, I saw it. I saw what happened. I said, I go. So I said, I started to go to tell the police what happened. I was going to go down and make a statement. So Sika, one of the wild Samoan, he said, I go with you, brother. And I don't know if many people knew Sika in his younger days, but Sika was one of the toughest men walking the face of the earth. So I felt if I'm going down there with Sika, ain't nobody gonna mess with me. So I went there, the guy told me, asked me what happened. I told the guy what happened. The guy said, well, according to the stab wounds, he said he had two 8-inch stab wounds, you know, 8 inches apiece. He said that is consistent, the cuts is consistent to my story. And he said, are you willing to testify in court about this? And I said, sure. He said, well, just sign the, what you call it, the confession or the statement that I made. They want me to sign a statement, so I signed a statement. And then they said, we also need contact information so that we could subpoena you to come and testify. So I said, I'll be here.
Still didn't know anything. And Nancy had said that she would pick me up at the airport. And Nat, so got there, Jeff's running around the airport. He's 7 years old, you have to remember, at the time. And I'm just standing there wondering, everybody speaks Spanish and you're speaking English, and it's kind of hard to communicate with a lot of people. And that's when Abby just came rushing by. And fortunately, he was the one that broke the news. But then he just rushed on by because he was getting out. He was running as fast as he could out. I still didn't know really what had happened or anything.
I went to the airport because I was leaving, going back to Canada. I said, I'm gone, right? And Bruiser Brody's wife came up to me and she says, oh, Ab, how's Frank? How's Frank? I says, Frank's gone, and she grabbed me. She says, oh no.
And so, of course, then I think I just went into shock. The rest of the time is kind of a blur.
I always admired him, and I always felt terrible about what happened to him. I always felt that justice was not served, you know, that, you know, a lot of the wrestlers that were in the dressing room that day really failed him, and the business failed him, and the promoters in Puerto Rico failed him, and everyone that was part of that failed him, and you know, I don't know how they look themselves in the mirror today.
If he'd been here and it had happened, I think he would have survived if he had got treatment right away. But Puerto Rico, they're lined up. On a Saturday night when I think it happened, they are lined up, waiting to go in to the operating theatre. So no, he had just too much damage by the time that but the doctor was very nice. He explained everything to me, and I could tell he was visibly upset too that he lost him.
I remember as if it was yesterday, I said, you know, Frank, aren't you concerned about traveling and going to all these places? And I mean, don't you ever worry about some of these guys? And I mean, he looked me in the eyes and said, Herb, he said, it's my life. He said, it's how I support my family.
And Frank had said, you know, make sure you tell my wife and my son I love them. I mean, he said that to several people, so I think he might have known that.
The way Frank went out, in my opinion, it should have never went down like that.
The dispute on who did it was never in doubt.
Even the district attorney, he kind of went through and he said, you know, there's a good chance that this will never come to trial.
They were able to have a trial and the guy found not guilty.
The trial was a joke, yeah. You know, I mean, it was, they declared him innocent on self-defense.
For a man to kill somebody like he did and say, look, I'm so small and Brody was so big and my baby. You don't get away with murder like that. And he did.
They had a trial. The jury went out, deliberated, I heard, 30 to 40 minutes, came back with a verdict of not innocent, but not guilty. Because Invader's defense was, he never disputed I did it, but he said his defense was self-defense.
You know, I never hear from them again, never hear from the police or nobody. Finally, I was in the dressing room, I was working for another company, I left Dallas, and I worked for another company called ICW at Mario Savodi. And Mario come up to me and said, Tony, they let him go. I said, let who go? They said, Jose.
I didn't even know the trial had taken place till after it had already taken place. So there was nobody there to testify on his behalf.
I think they had the trial on a Monday, if I remember correctly. My subpoena arrived in the mail on a Tuesday morning. I should have had it 2 weeks earlier.
They never contact me. They never contact Dutch Mantell. They never contact the Young Bloods. And we was witnesses. And neither Dutch Mantell, Tony Atlas, or Mark or Jay Youngblood got a subpoena. And it's the police I'm talking about now. They never contact us. We've all found out about the trial when it was over. They rushed that thing through.
I actually knew the verdict before I read the subpoena.
There's no explanation for what happened.
They didn't want me there. They didn't want Dutch Mantell there. They didn't want the Youngblood there. They didn't want anybody there to tell exactly what happened.
The only guy that could have covered was Jovic and I, and we didn't do that. Right. You know, we told the judge and in the courtroom, we said what we saw. We didn't really, because I didn't see any stabbing. I didn't see any weapon. I didn't see anything.
This is why I think that Invader was declared not guilty, because I think the jurors used Bruiser Brody's character against him, because he was a wild man and he was stomping and he was romping and he looked like he was half crazy. That was, and fans, they were true believers. And Invader at the time was almost like a national hero, and they were all Puerto Ricans on it. So they said, well, they weren't there, so they only had one eyewitness, and that was the Invader. So you know his story, it was self-defense, and he was afraid of him.
There was absolutely no problems whatsoever. There's been a lot of rumors. I know the truth of all the rumors that are going around because he talked to me. I knew exactly what was going on. I mean, he quite enjoyed going down there and working for Cologne. You know, and a lot of the boys were down there. He never really had a problem and never had a problem with this gentleman. So whatever it was I don't think anybody will really understand what happened.
It changed Puerto Rico for the worse. that there was talent that never went back.
I've never been back to Puerto Rico, and I worked Puerto Rico. I don't think any American should ever went back to Puerto Rico.
I'd been back several times since then, but it was never the same. Business was never the same. It was always great down there.
They were able to do business for years after that, but they never were able to really recreate their peak or get even close to their peak.
I'm at peace now that there never will be a definitive answer of what happened.
What might have been? What could have happened? What would life be like today if Frank was still here? What would have his career been like had this tragedy not happened? I can tell you, we talked a lot about him going to work for the WWF, now known as the WWE. He knew the business had changed, and that was the last place to truly make money in the United States. He knew he could draw big money against Hogan, and what a match it would have been. I can tell you, he would have gone on and done so many wonderful things in his life, not only for his family, but for so many others as well.
I mean, could you imagine if Brody, like you said, if he had went back in 88 or 89 and worked with Hulk? I mean, he'd still be there.
Brody goes up to New York, he's going there for one reason: to work with Hulk Hogan, make a giant payday, and then walk away. And I think Vince knew that, because Brody was, by that point, when you're talking about the late 80s, just about the only big-time star who hadn't been beaten by Hogan, who Vince hadn't brought into the WWF and in some form disposed of their talent. So here was Brody out there to do it. But he still liked working for Japan. That gave him independence. He didn't want to give up that independence. So that was a tricky deal. And I can remember there was talk about it.
Vince Sr. called our house a lot. So he had communication with Vince Sr. And he knew that things would change once Vince Jr. would, take over. He knew him and Hogan could draw one of the biggest crowds ever, which I think is not too far off, because that's the match that everybody would have loved to have seen, Hogan and Frank.
I think it's inevitable he would have gone, and I think it's inevitable he would have left.
I think Bruiser Brody would have been Bruiser Brody. I don't know how he would have handled corporate wrestling. I think he would have been much like me, because he was a rebel at heart. He wanted to be Bruiser Brody, and anyone that tried to take that away was going to have trouble.
I would have loved to have seen Hogan as champion against Bruiser Brody. It would have been huge box office.
Given his size, given his stature, him against Hogan would have been big business.
That would have been an unbelievable, if it really been box office, and Brody would have gone against the Hulkster, and a few times that Brody's name was brought up around when me and Hulk would go on some of the trips and we're talking about different stories and everything else. I think he really thought a lot of Bruiser Brody. I don't know if they ever met each other. I'm sure they probably did from time to time, but I know Hulk thought he was definitely a money in the bank.
I don't think it ever would have got to there, because sometimes Frank and Terry they're both worst enemy, and I don't know if Terry would have gone for it. I think Terry might have had a little fear that it wouldn't have ended every night the way it was scripted then, and I know he wouldn't take any chances.
Just never came. He died before while everybody else was getting on top, and it was growing under Vince Jr. that it just never came.
He was a complex individual. He was a very serious individual about certain things, and certainly about certain things in wrestling. And even as before what happened, he was thinking about what else he might do aside from wrestling.
There is no telling what Frank would have done with his life after wrestling, but he did have some plans, such as opening a sports agency office with Larry, and he wanted to help with the youth with the DARE program by going to schools and setting up a ring and doing skits about the dangers of drugs and alcohol. There was also plans of opening a camp for disadvantaged boys on our property. No matter what he would have done with his life, it would have made an impact on others. He certainly left his mark in the world of professional wrestling.
You're looking at Bruiser He was a man that marched to his own drum.
Frank was a unique person.
He was such an anomaly. His size, his agility. He was Bruiser Brody, and he could do everything.
I think the legacy is a great wrestler, tremendous entertainer. He entertained thousands of people. How many of us get to do that in our lifetime?
He was a phenomenon. He was a badass. He was smart. He had a great look. There was an excitement when he came into the ring.
And the thing he had is he could get over everywhere instantly. Just the first time in, he just had the look and the presence and the believability and everything going for him.
Brody was an athlete. Brody was tough as nails. Brody was out there, he was authentic, and Brody was different style, different looks, different talks, different interview, and so therefore he was unique.
You cannot teach charisma, you cannot teach stardom. They either got it or they don't got it. He had it.
He was with what I think we all wanted to be. Tell everybody, take this job and shove it.
He was a trailblazer. He was a man that stood up for himself. His matches are real.
He was the man. He was the man at that time.
I think he'll be remembered as one of the greatest of all time.
He stands on his own as a very unique individual persona.
Frank was just a different individual that did it his way, and Katie barred the door, and sometimes it worked right and sometimes it didn't.
He was a pivotal figure in professional wrestling all around the world.
The legend of Bruiser Brody carries on because he was real.
Frank Goodish was Bruiser Brody. Bruiser Brody was Frank Goodish. And so he was original, he was a natural. And so no one has followed in his footsteps close enough to be compared to Bruiser Brody.
If people only look back at the end of my husband's life, they are missing out on so much more. Frank Goodish was a complex man who loved his family. Professional wrestling was a big part of him, and I am not sure how it would have fit in as time went on. But I know being at home with his family excited him. It was exciting for me as well. Even though he is known worldwide as a professional wrestler, he is so much more than that. That is why Frank Goodish or Bruiser Brody will live on forever.